Today's exhortation is provided by Brother Casey Opitz. His title is The Timeline of the Crucifixion. We'll give our attention to Brother Casey. And I missed on the visitors, Albert and Amy Olex. Great to have you guys with us too. I had it written down, I missed it. If there's anyone else, we welcome you. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm going to talk fast this morning, real fast, because this isn't my typical talk, which is usually pretty short. I've got a little bit more to go through this morning, and we've got not too much, don't freak out, and we've got our baptism this morning as well, and we don't want to keep Evelyn in suspense or in anticipation too any longer than needed. Can I get a couple of people to hand out? I've been curious about the timeline of the crucifixion for some time. I know it's a couple weeks after Easter, but I thought this was an interesting topic nonetheless. I hope you'll find it interesting. I undertook this study to come to an understanding of what happened and in what order. I also wanted to come to a conclusion about whether Jesus was crucified on Friday afternoon, supporting Good Friday as a valid day of remembrance, or whether the evidence supports a longer period in the grave. So I started by reading the 4 accounts of Jesus' last days. To aid in this, I used a chronological Bible that we have, and it lays out the 4 Gospels side by side in a way that reflects the editor's best understanding of the order of events. And from this, I started to create my own timeline. And this was especially helpful in understanding the flow of events leading up to and during the Last Supper and through Jesus' death and burial. Then I started reading arguments published online in favor of a full 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. And they were convincing. And I was sure that they were right until I read arguments that favor that shorter period of time in the grave. Equally convincing. And I'll share some of that with you today. If you come away from today with your head spinning and just confused, I apologize, but come into this trying to challenge yourself to see if that won't happen, but if it does, don't be surprised. Because all I'm going to be doing is hitting the highlights and again, talking fast. And again, while this timeline study was interesting, at least to me, the more important and meaningful thing that is what Jesus did, what he endured, the trials he faced. And honestly, if I'm standing up here this morning, and any of us who stand up here on any Sunday morning, our overarching mission should be to help you appreciate what we have, what God has given us, not go through some sort of detailed exposition of something for its own sake. So what Jesus endured, the trials he faced, both the literal trials and those within his own mind, were what's really important. And it's absolutely true that Jesus was tempted in every way just as we are. In fact, his temptations at the end of his life were actually unlike, I would say, any experienced by any person before or since. Well, how could that be? Because he had the ability to stop and control everything that was happening to him. I think we could say that he actually had control, not the illusion of it. So his success was actually the ultimate example to us of letting go and letting God's will be done. He let go, letting the poor choices of evil men take place. So as we walk through the events of these last days and hours, I want to highlight what Jesus did and did not do while under that most unimaginable strain as truly our greatest example. Okay, here we go. You know, it's widely agreed that Jesus had been resurrected and first saw his disciples on Sunday morning. We know that, that's a given. The Bible is clear on it. When he was crucified, maybe less clear. The argument over whether Jesus was crucified on Friday or earlier hinges on Jesus' words. In Mark 8, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Matthew 12, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Okay, the end. I could sit down now. You'd love that. Forget it. The Christian world generally holds, though, that he was crucified on Friday, hence Good Friday. And this doesn't seem long enough because since Jesus died at about 3 in the afternoon, it only gives us the tail end of Friday, all day Saturday, and then a little tiny bit of Sunday. And it only gives us 2 nights, Friday night and Saturday night. And if Jesus' words are to be taken at face value, he would have had to have been in the grave for 3 nights. This means he would have had to die on Thursday afternoon. This would then give us Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. However, if he died Thursday afternoon, that means he was only dead all day Friday, all day Saturday, 2 days. So in order for him to have been in the grave for 3 full nights and 3 full days, he would have had to have died late Wednesday and then been resurrected late Saturday to then be seen Sunday morning. The Gospels give us so much information about timing, you'd think it'd be pretty straightforward, but it's not. It just isn't. And you'll see that this morning. Several things make it challenging to figure out. First, and this doesn't really throw a monkey wrench into anything, but it's just something you have to keep in mind and account for. The Jewish day starts at 6 p.m. So if we agree that Jesus died on a Wednesday, that also means that Passover was Wednesday, because it was actually held in the evening at the start of the new Jewish day. Just something you need to wrap your mind around and keep it wrapped around. Okay, so first, Mark 14, verse 12 tells us, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? It appears this would have to be the daytime before the evening of the Last Supper. So by the Jewish way of reckoning, this would have actually been the day before the Last Supper, because the next day was going to start at 6 p.m. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, oh, and here's another complication. We've got the Feast of Unleavened Bread together with the Passover. They're associated with each other. But Passover is first, excuse me, on the 14th of the month of Nisan, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on the 15th and runs for a full week. So how can the disciples only be finding the upper room on the first day of unleavened bread? And how can this be happening on the day the Passover lamb is killed if Jesus is the Passover lamb? Second, Jesus says, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you. Was the Last Supper actually Passover? How could it be if he was the Passover lamb? Third, the Gospels refer to the Sabbath in their accounts. For example, Mark 15 says, it was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Jewish council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Well, is that the traditional Saturday Sabbath or the Passover, which would also be a Sabbath, or both? Hard to know for sure. Confused yet? In short, it's difficult to piece all of this together, while also piecing together the timeline of the four gospel accounts. But what if we hold to the belief that Jesus was in the grave for 3 full days and 3 full nights in order to take Jesus' words literally? For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. All right, so if you look at your handout and look at the, because I'm sure that's a complete eye chart up there, especially if you're in the back, and look at the top of one side, and where it says Jesus 3 full days and 3 full nights in the grave. I took this from a site called BibleStudy.org, and first let's working across there. The month Nisan, working across the columns. Nisan is also Abib. Nissan, not Nissan, that's a car. Then you've got the day of the week, and so you've got the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th of Nisan. And then you've got the day of the week, and that's the Western day of the week. Changes at midnight. Time of day is my best guess, unless it's specifically stated in the Bible. And you've got something, if it something was specifically noted as having happened at that time, that's noted. You get the event that took place, and then you've got the multiple references that you can look at. So anyway, I took this 3 full days, 3 full nights from a site called BibleStudy.org, and this is just a very brief distillation of the high points to indicate the days on which major events took place. In Exodus and Leviticus, Nisan Abib is the month that Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are ordained to be started, on the 14th of the month. So, the Last Supper was held on the evening of the 14th of Nisan. This would have been the beginning of the 14th, according to the Jewish calendar that starts each day at sunset. The Gospels call it the first day of unleavened bread, and the day of the Passover lamb is traditionally killed. In fact, the Gospels actually say that this is the day the disciples asked where they should prepare the Passover. So that's an added complication, because it's hard to believe that they would have waited until the evening to bring up the subject. So we're already on a little bit of shaky ground. And we'll come back to this topic later. But it makes a lot of sense otherwise for the 14th to be the evening that Jesus ate the Last Supper, and this would have been Tuesday. Another point, he was probably arrested in the very early hours of the morning, still the 14th. I thought my cold was gone. His trials took place overnight, and he would have been sentenced somewhere around 8 a.m. This is now Wednesday, but still the 14th, and the Gospels call it the day of preparation. Jesus is crucified at 9 a.m., and he dies at 3 p.m., and he's buried just before sunset. And these times are noted in the Gospels, and this was still Wednesday. In one place, this is called the day of preparation before the Passover, and in another, the day of preparation before Sabbath. The Passover was, by definition, a Sabbath, so it works that this can be on a Wednesday. Then we have the Passover, and not much happens other than the setting of the guard. And it's interesting that this is called the day after preparation day. That's what the gospel calls it, the day after preparation day, rather than being called either the Passover or the Sabbath. So that takes us from Wednesday into Thursday. Then Friday, the women buy spices, but they didn't go immediately to the tomb. By this way of reckoning, they didn't go until Sunday, the first day of the week. And we usually think Jesus was raised around sunrise on the first day of the week, Sunday. But it's reasonable to think that he was raised around sunset the night before. And this would be in keeping with 3 full days, 3 full nights in the grave. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday nights, Thursday, Friday, Saturday days, and then raised. And this all seems fairly straightforward and necessary if Jesus was to be in the grave for that full period of time. And while I say straightforward, I also know you're thinking, well, no, it's not. This is confusing. So where does the idea that Jesus was crucified then on Friday, hence Good Friday, come from? We might be tempted to say it's simply a product of the Catholic Church or the Council of Nicaea. But that's too simple. It is true, actually, I take that back about Nicaea. They may or may not have been involved. They come up here in a second. It is true that the date that Easter is celebrated is a product of the Council of Nicaea. Shouldn't Easter be the Sunday following Passover? But it almost never is. As explained on this Catholic website. It says, at a certain point in early church history, since Jews and Christians were no longer on the same calendar, it made sense from a Christian perspective to calculate Easter independently of the Hebrew calendar. In fact, while the writing of the Nicene Creed is the most notable achievement of the First Ecumenical Council of the Church, another issue which the Council of Nicaea addressed was the calculation of the date of Easter. I love this. The council determined that Easter should be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, thereby tying the date of Easter to the movements of the sun and moon rather than to the Hebrew calendar. Great. So there's your explanation for why Easter is not associated with Passover. We might be tempted to say this was intentional, to separate Easter from anything Jewish. It's up to you. So back to the topic of 3 full days or something shorter. Now, if you go to the bottom of that page, there's a lot of your handout. There's a lot of reason to believe that Jesus was crucified on Friday. There really is. And here's the timeline for that possibility. And I was surprised to learn actually that Harry Whitaker supports this view of a shorter time frame. And he notes 3 things to support this. On the road to Emmaus, which we're told happened the same day that they found the empty tomb, one of the disciples says in Luke 24, and what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find the body. So if this is the 3rd day, then it can't have been 3 full days and nights since Jesus died. In fact, moving back a few verses to Luke 24, it says something similar. The angels, speaking to the women at the tomb, said, he's not here, he's risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified. Always count on Joe, thank you. And be crucified, and on the 3rd day, rise. Second point. Why would the women wait until Sunday? And why would they not have gone to the tomb on Friday to attend to Jesus' body? If they went and bought the spices on Friday, why did they wait? It is, and third point, it apparently is a common biblical idiom to say 3 days and 3 nights, when what's actually meant is the third day. A couple of examples of that. The chief priests told Pilate that Jesus had said, after 3 days, I will rise again. So they asked him to set a guard until the third day. Reasonably, they should have asked for a guard to be set until at least the fourth day, if they had understood Jesus was going to be in the grave for 3 full days and 3 full nights. They said, set a guard until the third day. And there are numerous other examples of this usage in the Bible, just a couple. In 1 Kings, for 3 years there was no war between Aram and Israel, but in the third year, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went down to see the king of Israel. And the king of Israel asked Jehoshaphat, will you go with me to fight against Ramoth Gilead? So for 3 years there was no war, but in the third year, Jehoshaphat started a war. Esther told Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. But then, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace. Finally, Harry Whitaker's final point, and this may be conclusive. A careful review of Leviticus 23 says that the Passover lamb is to be killed between 3 and 5 o'clock on the 14th of Nisan. Everybody agrees with that. But then it says the wave offering of first fruits and a second lamb were to be offered on the morning of the 16th. 14, 15, 16. Jesus was the first fruit. And the second lamb may be seen as the Passover lamb come to life again and being reconsecrated to God. Passover lamb is killed on the 14th, and the first fruits and the second lamb are presented on the 16th, not 3 full days and nights. So, okay, I don't know where you stand now, but there does seem to be enough reason to believe that we don't have to take the words 3 full days and 3 full nights strictly literally. Rather, as I've heard it expressed, there might be enough reason for us to believe that God allowed Jesus to remain in the grave the barest minimum time required. Maybe an hour during the first day of Friday, all day Saturday, and then raising him at the first possible moment Sunday, as if the grave could not hold him. All right. Have you made a decision? 3 full days, 3 full nights? Not? And we raised the question earlier, was the Last Supper actually Passover? There's some evidence that it was. Luke 22, then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go make preparations for us to eat the Passover. They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. And then in verse 15, he said to them, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. And then, well, I don't have the reference here, but then in verses 17 and 20, Luke mentions 2 cups. And that was part of the ritual Passover, which actually included 4 cups. But there's also plenty of evidence that the Last Supper was an ordinary dinner that took place the night before Passover. John 13 says, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress. The devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And then down in verse 29, since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. But if this was the Passover, it wouldn't have made any sense because all the shops would have been closed. And similarly, we're told that Joseph of Arimathea bought fine linen, and this would have been the next daytime, but still the same Jewish calendar day. And the shops would have been closed if this was indeed the Passover. And in John 18, we're told that the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning. To avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. If Jesus had been crucified on the Passover, then all of the things the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees did to arrest him and bring him before Pilate and Herod would have been irreligious and blasphemous. Imagine that. And they wouldn't have done it. What? Jesus died on the cross about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This was precisely the time of day when the Passover lambs began to be killed in the temple court. And there is no mention of a lamb at the Last Supper. This may not be a proof, but it seems important. So how do we reconcile these two views? When the disciples asked Jesus, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Remember, they didn't know he was going to die, and they wouldn't, and that he wouldn't be available a couple of days in the future. Also, I think realistically, they wouldn't have put off making these preparations until the last minute. I think they're already past the last minute at this point. So it makes perfect sense that they were asking a day early where he wanted to eat the Passover. Not that same evening. Even that seems too late to me, especially under the circumstances of a crowded Jerusalem. So they found the upper room where they were going to make preparations to eat the Passover, not that night, but the next night. But everybody ended up going there to this upper room pretty much right away and eating what they thought was just a normal meal. Ended up being the Last Supper in that same room. Harry Whitaker, again, suggests a solution for Jesus saying, "With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you." He suggests putting the emphasis on the word "this." Jesus was making this new communion ceremony a new Passover for us. He desired to eat this new Passover with his disciples. While all of this may be interesting, most of you are probably going, "No, it's not." But I'm sorry. While it may be interesting to some of us, I don't actually think the days of the week, the number of days or times of day is what's really important. But I think the example that Jesus sets for us during all of this time is, and he did extraordinary things. I believe everything we do here on a Sunday morning should have the goal of helping each other to appreciate what God and Jesus have done for us and are doing for us. For some of us anyway, reviewing dates and timelines can give us a sense of appreciation for the scriptures. And maybe it can help us appreciate that while a lot is revealed, not everything is entirely clear. But we'll know someday. So now flip your handout over. I want to take a moment for us to think about what Jesus was able to do over those last few hours. How he was able to focus his attention on his disciples and ultimately on you and me here today, despite knowing what was just about to happen and when it would happen. The number of recorded events that took place between 6 p.m. at the earliest, the evening of the Last Supper and 9 o'clock the next morning, when Jesus was nailed to the cross, is really just staggering. But it's not just about the number of events, but rather the emotional burden that each of these events placed on him when he was already at the limit of human endurance. This is beyond my ability to fathom. All I can try to do is appreciate it. The time of day is just a guess on my part again, but if they sat down to dinner at 6 p.m., like they would if they were us, who knows what time they sat down to dinner, then he did all of these things over just the next 5 or 6 hours. If they sat down later, the events would have been even more rapid fire. In every case, in everything he did, he was still teaching and guiding, and with one possible exception, while praying in the garden, only showing concern for his disciples. He washes their feet. He tries to dissuade Judas. Amazing that with all his power and knowing that he could have stopped Judas, he only talked to him. I think it's interesting that only John tells us about Judas leaving the group to betray Jesus. And only the other 3 Gospels give the account of the bread and wine, the new Passover meal, the new Passover meal. So trying to piece together the flow of events, I don't believe we can definitively say whether Judas had already left before the bread and wine, or if he was part of that communion. I personally lean toward him being there, being a part of it. But it can easily be read the other way too, that he left just beforehand. Either way, what would have been going through Jesus' mind? As it was, he was instituting this new Passover for his disciples, commemorating his death that had not yet happened. Can you imagine? And then, after this most solemn occasion of all things to happen, an argument breaks out again over who will be the greatest. Not only would this display of selfishness have been utterly disappointing after 3 years, but it would have made it clear to Jesus that his disciples still did not grasp, even after the bread and wine and his explicit statements, that he was about to die. Then Peter says he would die with him, probably because he thought it was an abstract, hypothetical thing to consider at worst. And then there's the swords. Can you imagine the emotional strain? To be hours from a horrible death, to talk about it pretty plainly, even with the bread and wine, to have his words misunderstood to the point of arguments and boasting, and yet he blesses them with 3 chapters, as recorded in John, of encouragement and final instructions, and with the promise of the Holy Spirit. He then blesses them with a prayer that had only his followers in mind. That beautiful prayer recorded in John 17, when he asked that the disciples might be one just as Jesus and God are one. He prays for his disciples that they might be protected from evil, and then he prays for us that we too might be one. These hypothetical people, 2,000 years in the future, he's thinking about us at this time. Then, probably coming up on midnight, they sing a hymn, walk across the Kidron Valley up to Gethsemane on the east side of Jerusalem. We know about him taking Peter, James, and John aside and asking them to pray. We can only try to imagine the emotional impact on him of their inability to stay awake at this time, that they still didn't understand. Though he had said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." And we can't begin to imagine the turmoil he felt as he prayed for his life 3 times, and yet only submitted to God. Over the next 3 hours, he was arrested, His disciples have run away. Jesus was distressed over Judas. He's taken to Annas. He's taken to Caiaphas. He surely heard Peter's denials. Luke tells us the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. He was taken to the council, and then to Pilate, and then to Herod, and then back to Pilate, and then finally sentenced, flogged, made to carry his cross, but was already too weak to do it, and then he was nailed to it. So much emotional anguish capped by so much physical anguish in such a short period of time. Blow after emotional blow, and yet perfect and remaining perfect, continuing to teach and support and comfort, not only then, but also even over the next 6 hours from the cross. The lesson for us is clear. When in anguish, our Lord remained focused outward to his disciples and to us, to all of the disciples who would come over the next 2,000 years and counting. When we're in anguish, always over something smaller than Jesus faced, we too would do well to face outward and think of others. But it's so hard. Can we even begin to appreciate how hard it was for him? Or was he so laser focused on his mission? Was his care and concern for others so sharply honed that any thought for himself, apart from the plea in the garden, was almost unthinkable? Can we follow Jesus? Can we be his disciples? Can we begin to try, even in the smallest ways, to prioritize others the way he did, to think the way he thought?